Blue-tongued skinks are biologically strange in ways most people never realize. They give birth to offspring born alive. They communicate using ultraviolet signals humans can't see, and they look built like armored tanks, yet their metabolism is surprisingly easy to disrupt. Those traits are exactly what make them fascinating, and they're exactly why their needs are so often misunderstood. Because blue-tongued skinks don't usually fail in obvious ways. They don't crash, they don't panic, they don't look sick early, they compensate, they keep eating, they keep basking, they tolerate handling. What changes first is subtle and they move less, they rest longer, they conserve energy. And this is the first thing most people don't realize. Blue-tongued skinks are energy conservation specialists, not lazy animals. In the wild, they move when conditions are right, when temperature, moisture, and safety line up. When conditions aren't right, they conserve. So, reduced movement doesn't mean calm. It often means the body is down-regulating. That's why inactivity is information in this species, not personality. And it's why environment matters more than any single feeding choice or supplement. Blue-tongued skinks look indestructible. They're thick-bodied, heavily scaled, low to the ground. But here's the contrast that fools people. They can lose significant muscle mass while still looking big and healthy. Fat pads hide muscle loss extremely well. So a skink can look chunky and solid while strength, endurance, and metabolic health are quietly declining. That's why assessing thriving requires more than just looking at size. Blue-tongued skinks also aren't one animal with one rulebook. They're a genus spread across very different environments. Some evolved in drier Australian regions. Others evolved in more humid Indonesian climates. And in the pet trade, blue-tongued skinks don't always come with precise background information. In some cases, exact locality simply isn't documented. In others, animals may come from mixed or uncertain lines over time. That doesn't mean anyone did anything wrong. It means the skink in front of you may not fit neatly into a single care label. So instead of guessing which rulebook applies, the safest approach is to build an environment with choices and let the skink tell you what it needs. Here's what that actually means in real terms. First, temperature. A blue-tongued skink should never live at one temperature all day. You want a clear gradient. The basking surface should reach 100 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit for most blue-tongued skinks. Some Australian types tolerate basking spots up to 110 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit, but higher is not better. It must always be optional. The cool end of the enclosure should stay around 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. At night, a drop is normal and healthy, with temperatures around 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Here's the surprising part. Because of their heavy bodies, blue-tongued skinks retain heat well. They don't need to bask constantly, so a skink that never leaves the basking spot may be struggling, and a skink that rarely basks may be using heat efficiently. Movement between zones is what matters. A thriving skink chooses where it needs to be. If your skink is pinned to one spot all day, that's feedback. Next, humidity. Humidity should also be a range, not a single number. For many Australian blue-tongued skinks, average enclosure humidity around 30 to 50% works well. For many Indonesian types, 60 to 80% is more appropriate. If you don't know which type you have, don't guess one extreme. Instead, keep the enclosure in a moderate middle range, around 40 to 60%, and then provide a humid hide. That hide should be a small enclosed space with damp substrate where humidity is much higher, often near saturation inside the hide. Here's the key insight. The hide matters more than the number. A skink that needs more moisture will seek it out. A skink that doesn't will ignore it. That choice is the diagnostic tool. Now, this only works if you do the second half of the job. You assess whether your skink is thriving. A thriving blue-tongued skink moves regularly, chooses to bask and cool down, sheds cleanly, maintains muscle tone, and shows curiosity without escalating stress signals. If sheds are poor, belly scales feel rough, the skink looks puffy, the eyes look sunken, or behavior changes, the environment needs adjustment, even if your numbers look right. That's not failure, that's feedback. Now, space, because choices only matter if there's room to make them. A blue-tongued skink in a small enclosure doesn't panic. It just stops moving. In the wild, blue-tongued skinks travel far more than most people realize. They forage, patrol, and investigate across large areas. Captivity collapses that world. When floor space disappears, activity drops. When activity drops, metabolism slows. When metabolism slows, weight creeps up. That's why enclosure size isn't about spoiling a pet. It's about allowing normal behavior. For most adults, an enclosure at least 4 feet long by 2 feet wide provides the minimum space needed for meaningful movement and thermoregulation. Height matters less than layout. You want a warm side and a cool side, a hide on both ends. Visual cover. Substrate deep enough to dig and reposition. Now UVB, where delayed problems quietly begin. Blue-tongued skinks don't usually get sick because something suddenly breaks. They get sick because something slowly fades. UVB bulbs don't stop working when they burn out. They fade quietly. The enclosure still looks bright. The bulb still turns on. The skink still eats. But the UVB output, the part that supports calcium metabolism, is already declining. Because blue-tongued skinks are heavy-bodied and slow to show weakness, UVB problems often don't show up until years later. This is something I see repeatedly in practice. Owners don't notice illness, they notice slowing down. The skink is still eating, still basking, still interacting, just moving less than it used to. And by the time that change feels obvious, the underlying problem has usually been developing quietly for a long time. This is why UVB isn't decoration, it's preventive medicine. I also see owners who have never provided UVB and feel reassured because nothing seemed wrong early on. That's exactly how compensation works in this species. The absence of obvious problems doesn't mean the biology isn't being stressed. It means the body is still adapting. Most pet owners don't measure UV output, and that's normal. So the safest approach is routine replacement. If you're using a linear UVB bulb, replace it every 6 to 12 months. If you're unsure what type you have, replace it every 6 months. Then reassess behavior and strength. Now feeding, where another quiet misconception shows up. Another pattern I see is owners using appetite as reassurance. As long as the skink is eating, everything feels okay, even when movement, muscle tone, or behavior has already changed. In blue-tongued skinks, appetite is often one of the last things to decline. As adults, most do best when fed 1 to 2 times per week, not daily. Meals should average 50 to 60% protein, 40 to 50% vegetables, with fruit kept under 10%. When adults are fed like juveniles, frequent meals, heavy protein, obesity becomes the most common hidden medical problem we see. And obesity isn't cosmetic. It stresses joints, it strains the liver, it worsens reproductive health, it shortens lifespan. And here's another biological twist. Blue-tongued skinks are live-bearing. They don't lay eggs. That means reproduction places higher long-term strain on calcium reserves and metabolism, especially in females. So chronic, slightly off care compounds over time. Now the tongue, that bright blue tongue isn't a greeting. It's a warning, and this is important. The full blue tongue display is usually a late-stage stress signal, not an early one. Before the tongue appears, the skink has often already reduced movement, stiffened posture, changed breathing, or frozen. The tongue reflects ultraviolet light, meaning other skinks see it far more dramatically than we do. It's not for us, it's a last line message. A thriving skink tolerates handling without escalating signals. If stress signals increase, handling or the environment needs adjustment. Now, enrichment. Blue-tongued skinks aren't sedentary by nature, they are selective movers. Without digging opportunities, visual cover, and room to reposition, they conserve energy, and that masks problems. Deep substrate, clutter, and occasional safe changes aren't extras. They are behavioral medicine. Now the red flags people wait too long to respect. Weak grip, tremors, poor sheds, mouth redness or swelling, wheezing or open mouth breathing, sudden weight loss, or a belly that looks swollen and tight. These aren't random. They're often the first visible signs that the environment is no longer supporting the skink's biology. Now here's a step I wish more owners did early, because it changes outcomes. Even if your skink looks fine, schedule a reptile experience veterinary exam soon after you get them, then repeat exams at least yearly. And don't just do a quick look over. Ask for a baseline health plan. That usually means a full physical exam, weight and body condition assessment, careful oral exam, skin and vent exam, and a discussion of your enclosure setup. And for many skinks, especially adults with unknown history, a set of baseline labs is incredibly helpful. At minimum, talk with your veterinarian about baseline blood work, a chemistry panel to look at organ function and calcium balance, and a CBC to look for inflammation or infection. Depending on your skink's history and what your vet sees, they may also recommend a fecal test for parasites and a follow-up plan if anything is borderline. Baseline labs do two things. First, they can catch problems early before the skink looks sick. Second, they give you a reference point. So if something changes later, you're not guessing what normal was for your skink. That's what thriving looks like. Not waiting for a crisis, but building a health baseline and monitoring trends. Now step back, and this might feel like a lot, but it isn't random. It all comes down to three things. First, environments that give choices, temperature gradients, humidity options, and space to move. Second, treating UVB as preventive medicine, not decoration, because problems appear long after the light fades. Third, feeding for the animal your skink is now, and reassessing strength, movement, and behavior over time. Blue-tongued skinks can live 20 to 30 years with proper care. That longevity can hide problems or reflect excellent stewardship. The difference is whether the environment and monitoring allow the skink to thrive, not just survive.